Here we go. Hello and welcome to the virtual Kansas City SQL Server user group. Glad you could join us for our Lunch and Learn with Matt Gordon presenting Use AI to make your data job easier and more fun. This has all my favorite things rolled into one. So yeah. We will be having Q&A throughout the presentation. Just as a note, this session is recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel shortly following. And as usual with our Lunch and Learns, we jump right in. And with that, I'm going to let you take it away, Matt.
Okay, all right, I'll get my screen shared and you should see my slides, I hope.
Yep.
All good? Okay. All right. So yeah, so if you're here hoping that I'm going to talk about the fundamentals of AI and all that, I'm not smart enough to do that. But if you're here for that, there is a link in my resources slide to an awesome 60-minute session that Buck Woody gave to the DBA Fundamentals virtual group. I believe it was earlier this year. That's really probably the best session I've seen on kind of the nuts and bolts of how all this stuff works. So if you're here for that, definitely hang around until I show the resources slide at the end and go to that. What I'm going to show is kind of practical use cases for AI powered stuff that we as data people can use now. Some of it works well, some of it you'll see doesn't, but I want us all to be aware of all of it, because the thing with all this, and you're going to hear me say this over and over again, it changes constantly, it improves constantly. So, something I may show you that I say, I don't really like it, or you see something and you're like, well, that I'm not a fan. It's still good to have in your toolbox, because some of this stuff really is going to get to the point, if it's not already, where it's doing pretty amazing things. A little bit about me. So I have written a couple books. The one that's relevant to today is Beginning Azure Cognitive Services. So that came out like 2.5 years ago. So in terms of AI, that's ancient history. There's still some relevant content in there. But it's funny, when we talked to the publisher about what the title should be, they were very fixed on this beginning series of books and using what Microsoft called whatever it was. And Azure Cognitive Services, which we'll talk about here in a second, is now under the umbrella of Azure AI and all that. And there were discussions of, hey, we're going to sell a lot more books if AI is in the title, because that's really what all this stuff is. That's not what we did, but that is what it's about. So, and can confirm we would have sold more copies if we had put AI in the title. And yeah, the picture on the right is me getting to do pretty much my favorite thing, which is drive race cars. So if you ever want to talk about that, I'm always happy to do that. I am SQL at Speed everywhere, online, GitHub, Twitter. I refuse to change that to X. My blog is sqlatspeed.com. Blog content's a little sparse, but we'll be ramping that up this fall around AI and Fabric real-time intelligence as well. And I'm the Microsoft lead data architect for Centric Consulting. And my slide won't advance, so let's try that again. Hey, there we go. All right, brief thing here. None of this stuff really matters. What I want to call your attention to is the bullet point at the bottom. So glad you're here. Getting involved in data community stuff, whether it's virtual, in person, whatever, has absolutely changed my life. The opportunities it's given me, the jobs it's introduced me to, the friends I have because of it. I always like to say the worst case from getting involved in this stuff is you're going to learn something you didn't know. The best case is it might change your life too. So if this is your first one of these kind of meetings, keep coming. If you're here and you're like, gee, I wish my town had something like this, it probably does. If you Google Azure Tech Groups, or you can use Bing because it's a Microsoft site, that will give you an ability to search by your town for user groups talking about AI, Fabric, SQL, all that stuff. So there's tons of them out there. They're adding more. It seems like every week. So it's a great time to be a part of it and see where it takes you. Okay, so on to the AI stuff. So, and I'll take questions throughout if you want. I can't see the chat. My second screen isn't working. So if you just kind of want to shout out if somebody says something. I'm curious on this slide, so I'll go through my thoughts. But if anybody feels like I left anything out or wants to argue about any of it, I'm perfectly happy to do that. So what is AI? So my dad, who's not technical at all, he's into cars, does the racing stuff. Uh, he thinks it's ChatGPT because that's all he hears about on the news. Like AI is that. Um, and for non-technical media, I would argue that yeah, that's probably where it stops. Some people say it's a whole bunch of hype. The very first time I gave this talk, it was in person at SQL Saturday, Minnesota last year, and there was a guy when I got to the slide, it didn't say that here. So I did the first point, and then I said, in the audience, what do you all think it is? And he's like, oh, it's just a bunch of hype. It's not going to amount to anything, which did beg the question of why he came to my session to learn about it. But we actually ended up having a really nice chat afterwards and all that. And he wasn't wrong. There is a lot of hype around this. It's not all hype though. There are some practical things. That's why I built this. When I was writing the dedication for the book, around the time I was doing that, my son came in to my room while I was writing my chapters and wanted to know what the book was about. He was about 9 or 10 then. So, trying to explain AI and ML and all those kind of associated concepts to a 9 or 10-year-old is challenging. He had just done like a Python code camp for a few weeks. So I'm trying to kind of boil things down to basic terms. He looks at me and he's like, so it's just a bunch of if-then statements that run really fast. And it's not. And if you watch Bucks talk, you'll see like, well, no, it's not that. But conceptually, it almost kind of is. So I always thought that was cute and not a terrible way to describe it for somebody who's just getting started with tech and code and all that stuff. The fourth bullet, I think, is the most complete definition that I've seen. That's why I've included it here. We don't need to read through it. But I do like that kind of middle bit where it talks about performing tasks normally requiring human intelligence. You'll see some of this stuff, are we at the human intelligence level? Probably not. Some of it, does it seem like we are? Maybe. So does anybody feel like I left anything out here or, overstated anything?
Looks good to me.
All right. So what is it to data people like us? So it could be Copilot experiences in our dev environments. As you may have noticed, Microsoft is putting Copilot experiences everywhere. And if you use a tool and it doesn't have a Copilot yet, odds are it will. Obviously, as we head into the fall here, you've got Past Summit in early November, you've got Ignite in mid to late November. There's going to be tons of announcements around this, and co-pilots where they weren't before, and co-pilots that work better than they used to, and all that stuff. So for us, it could be something like that. And there are co-pilot experiences in the development tools that we use. And if you're sitting there saying, well, Management Studio doesn't have one, that's true. But Azure Data Studio does, and we're going to talk about that one a little bit later. It could be some sort of robot tuning our code and tuning our devs code and making our queries perform better and all that. There's a lot of hype around that. Not to disparage it, but if you've seen, and very recently, really in the last few weeks, you've seen Microsoft folks start to talk about the Copilot in Azure SQL, and they've started to demo some of its performance recommendations and things like that. You're starting to see the beginnings of, okay, so maybe it's trying to do some performance tuning. You'll read very overhyped articles that say this is the end of the DBA and all that. It's not. Uh, that job doesn't go anywhere. It does change a little bit, and that's part of the reason I built this session. So we're aware of everything that's going on and can use it for our good and for others' good. But it could be robots tuning some code that we used to have humans do before. It could be ChatGPT helping us program in a language that we don't know. Like I was recording actually some demos this morning for a session that I'll be giving next week. And we talked about, so it was talking about like Azure Data Explorer and real-time intelligence in Fabric. That uses a language called KQL, which does look different from T-SQL. but there's a copilot in there to do it. ChatGPT can also help you, where you could give it a T-SQL query, because probably if we're all SQL Server folks, we know how to do that. And you could say, please write this in KQL for me, and it'll do that. Or if somebody hands you something and says, hey, you're a consultant, and you have a new customer that needs a little bit of work done in Python and you don't know it well, you can use tools like these to say, I need a Python function that takes input X and gives output Y, and it'll do a decent job at that. It'll at least get you started. None of these tools turn out absolutely perfect code over and over again. They at least get you started. They give you some sort of baseline where if you don't know anything about it, it'll help. Where it also helps me, and that's why I say that at the end of that third line, is if you're kind of stuck on a way to do it, like you've coded something a certain way, it's kind of what your brain is focused on, and you can't break that focus. We like, what do? You should get up and take a walk. That's always helped me before. But you can use tools like this to just copy and paste code in there and say, how should I change this? How can I make this better? And some of them do a decent job at that. The fourth bullet, if you take nothing away from this slide, and honestly nothing away from this talk, at least take this away. So there's a guy that I used to work with named Steve Hughes. So he's data on wheels on Instagram and YouTube and all that. He's been battling ALS for the better part of the last 2 years. In fact, if I had shown you the picture of the race car from a different angle, we have a fundraising campaign on the back of the car for the charitable work that Steve does with the ALS Foundation. Anyhow, AI powered tools and experiences and some of the stuff we've talked about, some of the stuff we will talk about, have allowed him to work and to contribute presentations and all those sorts of things that without these tools he couldn't, and others who are facing challenges similar to his can't. So like I said, if you take nothing else away from this talk at all, but you're like, well, I really, what's this AI thing? That's helping real people right now do things that they otherwise couldn't do. And so if you're wondering where to take this tech, think about ways to help people, if nothing else. So I'll kind of get off that soapbox, but there's some really amazing stuff that happens in this space that helps folks like Steve. Last but not least, we might look at it as an annoyance. I have sat across from executives that say some version of, well, I don't need my data team, or in 2 years, I'm going to get rid of this whole team because, quote, the AI will do it all. Those are generally executives that don't understand what the AI is. And that's okay. That's not really their job, usually, to be deeply technical, but it is often our job. And we may have to combat notions like this, like, well, if Power BI has a copilot, what do I need devs for? If Azure Data Studio has a copilot, what do I need DBAs and data devs for? We need them for a lot, because you still need people that understand the data. You still need people to make the queries perform. You still need people that understand the workloads that all this is running against. None of this stuff does a good job with that. And those are complex problems to solve. But this mindset is out there, where it's like, well, I'm not going to need those folks, or I'm going to need different types of people because the AI will just handle all this. And my favorite story about that is I sat at a client last year roughly, and they had wanted us to put together some of the AI enabled or AI powered features of Power BI. Some of those are 3 or 4 years old, but this organization was not aware of those, and they're of course, like many organizations have right now, they were under like an AI initiative. Hey, we need AI powered thingies in our stuff, and it's that vague. And so they came to us and say, well, okay, show us what Power BI can do with all this AI stuff. And so we put together some visuals and said, here's how we built it. It's obviously built on a well-modeled data set. You have to set your synonyms right and the verbs so it understands in kind of human terms what the tables are and all of that. And the first two things we showed them were really cool. And they're like, how long did it take to build this? And we said, well, it's just basically a few lines of Q&A. They're like, wow, this is amazing stuff. Of course, you could see the wheels turning for some of the higher ups. They're like, wow, I don't need this room full of people if this stuff's that good. Then we got to the third one. And the third one, somebody immediately spoke up and said, oh, that's wrong. So, okay, how do you know? And they said, well, I know that because that, and I can't obviously say who the client was, and I can't really explain a lot about what the data was because then you might know who they are. But it said like that data comes in too high. We know the system upstream, the calculation it does to feed the data downstream to the system that fed this, it overdoes certain things. So it sends us data that's kind of out of whack. That's just, it registers too high on the scale that it needs to measure. And that's wrong. And it kind of struck me because the AI that they want us to use, it doesn't know that. It would be hard to give it that kind of context ever. You need people that do understand the data and the business and what the data is trying to tell us to say, oh, okay, the thing the robot built is cool, but it's wrong because the data it was fed was wrong. And it's kind of one of the underlying principles of all this stuff. Any chat interface, any virtual agent, any AI powered anything is only as good as the data that it's trained on. And if that data is bad, if that data has gaps, if that data is flat out wrong, then all the AI experiences that are powered by that will be wrong too. So there's always going to be a place for data folks like us. Just the name of the role and the shape of the role might change a little bit. But the AI is nowhere close to doing it all. Any thoughts about that before we move on?
Nothing in the chat.
Okay. All right. So I mentioned cognitive services at the start, not to sell books, though my wife is impressed when somebody buys one. But so you understand that this stuff, though the documentation itself for the APIs that underpin all of this is fantastic. Even for somebody like me who is, I would say, a below average app dev, I'm able to follow tutorials and labs and things like that in languages that I'm familiar with a little bit and get a lot of this stuff working in code. I don't need to go to the low code and no code experiences that we're going to talk about on the next slide. But I want you to understand that if you go to a page and you're kind of bingle-fooing through this stuff and you end up on a page and you were looking for some of the AI stuff we talked about and the page refers to cognitive services or something, it's all the same now. You're in the right place. Even some of the URLs, like you'll see when I show you the language studio here in a few minutes, you'll see that cognitive is part of the URL it's in. That's not really technically the official branding anymore. For marketing, this is all Azure AI, as that last bullet says. These are, at least in my mind, individual services kind of under that umbrella. So speech does exactly what you think. It can produce speech. The first version of this talk actually contained a dramatic poetry reading from Speech Studio of a song that ChatGPT wrote about how DBAs are mean. I don't have time to do that part anymore because some of the demos now take longer than they used to, but speech is capable of silly things like that. It can also do things like you can secure a room by somebody's voice. So, it's capable of recognizing a speaker for transcription reasons, for security reasons. It's also capable, and you've seen this, there's been controversy around a couple movies in the last couple of years where they used models of somebody's voice to have them saying things in a film that they didn't actually say. Speech service does all of that. Language, where we're going to spend some of our time here, does all the stuff you think it would. It translates from language and it works with the translator service to do that. It also does things like sentiment analysis, where you give it some text and it says, this is positive, this is negative, this is neutral. It can take very large blocks of text and kind of give you a heat map. So, and we'll see an example of this later, but it can be a great tool for like monitoring knowledge bases for a product or customer support forums or any sort of, outside communication about the company that you work for or the products that you have. Um, Language and some of the services underneath that can really help you understand what's going on and do it at a scale where you couldn't have a bunch of humans reading social media and boards all day long, but you can have this stuff do it. Vision is really cool. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on that here. Vision has a studio just like all these other ones do. Um, and it's another one of the studios that has cognitive in the URL. My favorite example of Vision is, so it analyzes images and videos and extracts information from them, and it can do other things too. That's way underselling what it does. But we had an example in the book that I always thought was cool. So it was from a state where they're like Department of Natural Resources that was in charge of caring for rivers and lakes and dams and all those things. They used the Vision API at that point, even though it was called Cognitive Services. They weren't really calling it a service individually. And it would take, there were still photos of the water line on these dams statewide. It was like every 10 or 15 minutes, it would take an image. And it would do some things with Azure Logic Apps, which we're going to talk about here in a few, where if the water line was above or below kind of the safe threshold, it would use Logic Apps to trigger a workflow to send out alert emails, texts, pages, stuff like that, to say, hey, this dam, the water's too high, the water's too low, might indicate an impending dam failure or flood or something like that. So, really kind of interesting, actionable stuff with it now at this point, a 4 or 5 year old version of this. It's come a long way since then. You've probably, if you watch the news in tech at all, OpenAI has been a thing. Microsoft has invested heavily in them, billions of dollars over the last few years. So, I think it's an interesting time to be talking about AI in the Microsoft ecosystem, because they've spent a lot of money to kind of lead the race. And at least for me, they still are. It's a very dynamic race. Databricks is investing heavily. Meta, you've seen that. Like, the race isn't over by any stretch. But Microsoft had a vision years ago and is definitely executing on it and definitely supporting it with dollars. But long story short, all of this stuff, no matter what it's called, Azure AI is the umbrella that it's under. That's the overarching marketing term, and it really fits all of this stuff well. Any questions about any of that? Okay. Okay, so I mentioned that these were in our APIs. But if you're like me, like I said, below average app dev, I am not, I'm going to do everything I can to avoid writing grown-up code to call this stuff. But there are a lot of low-code, no-code ways to do this. So Azure Logic Apps, which I just mentioned, if you're not familiar with those, I'll give you kind of a 30-second crash course on what those are. I like to call them event-driven workflow containers, and not containers in like the Docker sense, containers in the Tupperware sense, where it's just an empty thing and it drives off an event. So if you're using one that does like a sentiment analysis of of tweets about your company, you could say when a tweet is posted, so it drives off something called a trigger, which basically that trigger connects to something, and they have native connectors. It's up close to 400 now, but it connects to social media, ticketing systems like ServiceNow. I think it connects to SAP, like a lot of kind of enterprise workflow systems, social media, all that stuff. It'll connect to that, and you could tell it when a new tweet is posted that contains my company's handle. Sentiment analyze it and store that off in an Azure SQL database, or something like that. Logic apps are a really cool, lightweight, and fairly easy to use way of connecting to disparate systems and doing stuff. So I think they're really cool, not just to call this, but I just think they're interesting all around and kind of under marketed. So hopefully if you didn't know what those were and now you do, you think they're cool when you go kick the tires on those. From there, so like I said, Power BI is by no means new to the Azure AI game at all. It's had elements of natural language processing in it for years. Like I did a session back in the summer of 2020 when basically everybody's sessions were virtual like this. I did a session for the Power BI user group in Minnesota that went over some of what it could do then. And that's some of the stuff we're still showing to clients now, and they're like, "Wow, this is amazing," because it wasn't marketed very well. That's starting to change, obviously. But yeah, Power BI's got a lot of kind of the stuff we talked about with language earlier and Q&A features and all that. A lot of power there. Power Apps and Power Automate we'll kind of talk about together. Those are, I won't say competing, but two different kind of low code, no code options that Microsoft gives us to do things. I will show a demo here in a few minutes of what Power Automate can do on the AI side of things. The unfortunate thing about that demo is while it's really cool, it's the most expensive one I run. So almost everything I'm talking about here, there's a free tier of this stuff. So if you're sitting out here saying, well, I just have my own personal Azure account, I don't have money to burn on this stuff. I don't either. So I try to show you everything that's free or very, very cheap, like pennies. Power Automate isn't that. So to get the cool AI builder stuff, I actually had to bump the license that I have. So I pay an extra $15 a month to get enough of those credits to run demos and things like that. But it's a cool demo, so I've left it in there. The studio experiences we've talked about a little bit. We'll see one in a couple minutes. What those are, it are basically it's like a development interface. It's all web-based. It's all browser-based. And it gives you some guided tours, some kind of labish type things, and some examples to work through of how to use the different capabilities of all these services. So you don't have to go download Visual Studio and download a bunch of code and run a bunch of app stuff to do it. Like you can go into these experiences and kind of see what the power is, generate the code from there if you like, and then take it elsewhere. So like I said, we'll see one here in a minute. The URLs do change more often than I would like. So I would say if you're curious to look for the Vision Studio or something like that, I actually had to Google before this talk what the URL was, and I believe it's vision.cognitive.portal.azure.com, which doesn't roll off the tongue at all. So if you're trying to find it and can't, Google or Bing is going to be your friend there. And then we talked about how if you're sitting here as an app dev or somebody that loves writing code, these are all REST API calls under the covers. Totally valid to do that. Like I said, other versions of kind of this session over the years, I've been talking about this stuff for 7 years now. I would show some C# console apps. So by all means do that. And like I said, the documentation of the APIs and how to call them and everything is really great. As much as I'm making fun of the naming and stuff, the docs are solid. So don't be scared to use those at all. Any questions about any of that?
Go.
Okay. All right. So bonus points if you know who this is. So we talked about how there are some managers that are kind of mean and they don't understand the way this tech works. They don't understand what the AI is. And so let's put ourselves in the shoes of somebody that started a new job and they're, the new company's very AI focused. And we don't need people for a lot of stuff. Like you don't need to talk to the team you're going to be working with. We've just given you this welcome bot. You're going to talk to this bot and it's going to tell you everything you need day one to do your job. So let's go introduce ourselves to this bot. All right, so hello and welcome. We're a data person. We've been given no other guidance other than go to this URL and talk to the bot on your first day. So we're data, like what databases do we have? And I know Buck Woody says never type in a demo, but there's no way to do this demo without it. So sorry, Buck. All right, so it comes back to us and says, so obviously that bot, if you know who the cartoon character is, a bit sarcastic, so it's already making fun of us a little bit, but it says, we have SQL Server on-prem, we have Azure SQL, and we have Access. It's like, okay, well, I know the list. How do I connect to it? Because I need to know that, right? So how do I connect to SQL Server? Comes right back to us, says use Azure Data Studio, which is cool. It's got a link there for us. Gives us some instructions and puts some other editorial commentary in there as well. Sends us a username and password in free text, which is fantastic. But so we're not getting the best vibes from this company at all. But here we are. So we know how to connect to SQL Server. It's given us some useful information. It's given us a link. How do we connect to Azure SQL? Because we're going to need to know that. That was the second one mentioned. So download ADS again. And then we get to step 3 and it says send a fax to our cloud data team asking them for creds because they report to a different VP and won't talk to us. It's not great. Definitely seen scenarios like that in the past, but okay, the fax thing is pretty sketch. And since we're talking about faxes, this seems like a great time to learn how we should connect to Access. So how do we connect to Access? Okay, so we have to drive to somewhere that is definitely a real street in the town that I live in. There's an obscure Monty Python joke. So usually when I give this talk in person, I say, if somebody gets the joke, come up to me later and I'll buy you a beer. We can't really do that here. And it's the middle of the day, so we probably shouldn't be doing that. But anyhow, so we've gotten steps. We had a conversation with a bot. Does anybody have any idea how I did that?
You program like a tone.
So I missed the first part of what you said.
There's something to do with a specific tone. Like I'm used to ChatGPT, so not these.
So kind of. So this is I start with this one because it's like the gateway drug to all the other AI stuff. So we'll close the chatbot, which was randomly on my website for some reason, and we'll see how this works. So I created this in Language Studio about a year ago. And it's what they call, so Q&A Maker, if you used to play with cognitive services stuff back in like 1920, 21, they introduced something called Q&A Maker where you could point it at a web page, you could upload a PDF, a couple other kinds of documents, and it would create like this question and answer kind of chat experience. It was okay. They've now built on that. So now what this is it's called custom question answering. A little less catchy than Q&A Maker. But so all that was, so if you go in and look at this project, and like I said, this is another one of these studios where you've got cognitive in the URL, even though it's not marketed as that. And you'll see this was a Word document. If you go in here and look, this was a Word document. So all it uses is the basic headings. There's no fancy formatting in Word. I didn't have to do like crazy stuff. I highlighted kind of main questions as heading 1, responses is like heading 2, responses to those to do like a multi-turn thing is heading 3. And then what you can do in here, so once you upload it, kind of breaks the document down and it's like, hey, I think this is what you sent me. And then you can edit the question and answer pairs that it gives. You can also give it alternate questions as well. So if you find, and we don't have time to go into this, but if you find in the logging, because all this stuff logs everything it gets and everything it sends back, if you say, well, people aren't asking what databases can I connect? They say, tell me about our data environment. It will respond with this answer to that same thing. So this is not a rich, like ChatGPT-like experience, but it's close and it's quick. Like I said, this took me 10 minutes from document upload to then from here what it does, it creates an Azure bot farm, It kind of does all that for you. It holds your hand through that. Then at the end, you get some iframe code to drop that chat into a web page like I did. You can also drop it in, you can put it in Teams, Slack, and any sort of messaging platform at all. And it's super easy. You don't have to know what vector search is. You don't have to know what embeddings is or any of the AI powered search stuff that's super, super cool. You just need a Word document, an Excel document, a PDF, a web page, something like that, and you upload it into Studio here. You may have to edit some of what it does, maybe not, and you've got something in like 15 minutes. So think about like a menial part of your job that, if somebody always asks you like, what database does, lives on which server or which report is in which workspace, and it takes your focus away from the fun part of your job. You can put all that information in a Word doc, an Excel doc, set up one of these, and there's a resource link at the end that goes through the actual setup. Don't have time to show it all here. I think this is really cool, and like I said, it's kind of a gateway drug into this stuff. So any questions about that?
Questions in the chat.
Okay. All right, so we met Bender. Wasn't a great experience. Usually isn't. So we've started doing some AI stuff, and it gets more powerful than that. You can enable some pretty rich multi-turn stuff in there. That would kind of be, if this is a 100 level session, that's probably 200. Now we'll make it a little more data focused. So we can't do a show of hands, but hopefully some of you, because every time I've given this talk, some people don't know that there's Copilot in Azure Data Studio. There is. Some people don't know what Azure Data Studio is. So while I'm switching over to pull that up, Azure Data Studio is basically, so it's really terribly named. You can connect to on-prem stuff in here. It used to be called SQL Operations Studio. When it went GA, marketing got a hold of it and said, let's call it Azure Data Studio. And every time I have given a talk about ADS ever, and I say that, what I just said, somebody's like, oh, I didn't know that. So we can blame the marketing folks for the lousy name, but it's a lightweight database development client. It's not a management studio replacement. They're both going to coexist for years and years, but it's lighter weight and it can do some cool stuff, and it can connect to not just SQL Server and Azure SQL, but a bunch of other stuff. It also has the notion, kind of like Visual Studio Code, because it's a very similar kind of app, of extensions. So extensions are here, and what those are is there's a community marketplace for those. You may wonder, why are you explaining extensions to us? This talk is about AI. It's because to get Copilot, you need to install the GitHub Copilot extension. And I'll call out here again, this is not free. So the level, I think typically the monthly license you need, it's like GitHub Pro. It's usually, I think, $4.99 a month. Hopefully through work or some other avenue, you have that level for free, and then Copilot doesn't cost anything. But I do want to call that out. If you're like, oh, this is really cool, you will have to pay a few bucks to use it if you don't have another way to get that. But you would go to this extensions link here, you'd search GitHub Copilot, you download it. Their extensions are very small. They'll generally say, do you want to install me? You say yes, runs for like a second or two. It asks you to restart ADS, and then you've got it. So once you've got it, there's a couple things you can do in here. So I am connected to a database that I have running locally, that this table, so you accidentally saw the extensions marketplace there. Let's get back to our databases. All right, so you see this table is called Walmart Products Kaggle. So if you're not familiar with Kaggle, it is, I don't know, best way to describe it is kind of like a marketplace of data sets. There's a lot of free data sets out there. They do a lot of competitions for like data science, ML, stuff like that. Great place to get data sets you don't have to pay for. Because one of the things that's frustrating about all this AI stuff is, well, I need some interesting data to work through. Like generally, you can't take a customer's data and go play with it. So something like this and a product set like that is cool. You've noticed that Microsoft's mixed it into a couple of their demos because there's a lot of rich product description in here. So it's great to do kind of text search and all kinds of stuff with it. So I've used it here. So how Copilot works is you'll see I've got a comment here, and it says write a query to return the top 100 items in the Walmart products Kaggle table. What I am going to do, so if you had just seen me type that live and I'd hit tab, what would be here on this line would be gray italicized text. That would be its initial suggestion of what the query is. But in the interest of time, I'm going to dive a level deeper than that for you. So I hit Control Enter, and you'll see we get the GitHub Copilot Suggestions tab off to our right. And it's interesting how this has changed. So it sends back fewer suggestions than it did even a few weeks ago. But so it would have given me this. So this I'm going to go for some audience interactivity on. We said I'm connected to a SQL Server database. I told it to write a query to return the top 100 items in the table. Would suggestion 1 work?
No,
Because it doesn't know what it's hooked to.
there's no selected database or anything.
Right. Well, so even if you do, so like if I go up there, it still doesn't understand. So I'll kind of skip to the conclusion of this. There's a couple other things I want to show you, but this doesn't have a good sense of context yet. So if you've seen what Microsoft's showing in Portal with like the Azure SQL Copilot and stuff like that, it's been a lot of work that's gone on behind the scenes to know, hey, you are in Azure SQL land. You are speaking T-SQL, all those sorts of things. This doesn't inherently do that. And sometimes, and it's interesting. So like I did this a week ago and it gave me, and I see that it hasn't done it here. It also gave me index suggestions, even though I didn't ask for that. And that's been a kind of a recurring thing I've seen with the GitHub Copilot in this is I'll ask it to write a query. Now, if you say in the comment, how can I make this query faster? It will give you a create index statement that it thinks will, but sometimes it just gives you one that you didn't ask for. It like last week, it did that. So like suggestion 3 was the query that's right. It's actually the first one that would work, but it also had a create index statement there too. So it does some things that are a bit odd. So you can correct all this, but the kind of the recommended method via the blog from the team that did this is what's called brain dump. So you tell it use database blah 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 here, and I'm pointing at that, but you can't see me point here. So you'd say that, and then you'd put all the create table statements in for all the tables. So I'm asking it to do something very simple, but if you're asking it to like write joins and stuff like that, if you put all of that in there, it's going to do a really good job. If you brain dump and kind of give it the context it needs, it's going to do well. But it's not functioning intuitively like a human mind would think yet. So that's the main takeaway I want to give you. A couple other things I want to call out here. So this is a query. So I will say response time can be variable here. So you'll see that I've kind of pre-baked this stuff. I don't do a lot of live demos of the Copilot because it's left me hanging a couple times for a couple minutes, and there's a lot to get into in this hour. So that's why this is kind of TV food show. Like I just pulled this out. You see where I talked about the index suggestion earlier. This was something that I did live once upon a time, and I've just saved it. So I had this query here. I then told it to, I said for the query above, give me an index, and it did. Now, is that going to make that query better? Probably. Does it have any sense of all the other workload on this server? Not a bit. So again, just like DTA or any kind of automated tool we've ever used through the years, you have to give it context, and if it doesn't have that, it's going to be laser focused. Like any AI powered anything is, it's going to give you a confident answer based on what it knows. But if it doesn't know much, that answer may not be right. So hopefully you have learned that ADS exists if you didn't know that, and that it has a Copilot. Now you'll notice I'm a little underwhelmed, but I want you to know that it's there because it's gotten better. Like, I've given some version of this talk for a year with demos kind of moving in and out and all that. And this gets better every single time. So know that it's there, and it can be a useful tool if it's used the right way, and it's going to get more intuitive and better, all the time. So, of course, I had to work a car thing in. Let's talk about a Copilot that worked really, really well. So I mentioned, even though this isn't data specific necessarily, Power Automate, I feel like, is something that's really cool. Doesn't necessarily get a lot of love because it feels like maybe our office, kind of our business apps friends get to play with it. Data people, maybe not. It can do a lot of cool data stuff. And I think it can be the easiest way to kind of show some of this AI stuff off. Like Logic Apps are really basic and it can do some things there. But as the capabilities of these services have increased, it kind of sometimes outstrips Logic App's ability to comfortably do certain things, and that's where Power Automate steps in. So what I was trying to do is actually reprise the first demo of this stuff I ever built 7 years ago for the debut of this talk last year. And I was trying to do it in Logic Apps, but the sentiment analysis API has gotten much more powerful in the last 7 years, as you might guess. The data set it returned was very rich. There were a lot of arrays. Instead of just a single score, like I analyzed this text as positive, negative, it's returning arrays by section of the text and all this stuff. And I was getting super frustrated. I spent probably 6 hours trying to build it. And it wasn't at a place where I could look out at the crowd and say, see how easy that was, because it just wasn't. And I was in Scotland actually at the time, so I had a whiskey, took a little walk around, and said, I wonder if Power Automate can help me here, because it's kind of like Logic Apps on steroids with a little bit prettier interface and all that. So let's see what it did. So when you go into Power Automate, it slaps you in the face with a giant Copilot thing. That night, or that morning, to be fair, that was welcome. It's like, I don't know what to do. So I just typed in here, basically, send me a Teams message with the sentiment of an email. Type that in. And if you go over, so I typed that in here. If you go over to my flows, so it uses what they call in Power Automate AI builder components to do that. Under the covers, it's essentially calling these services. It puts a nice wrapper on it. You don't have to know anything about code to do this. This has no code in it. So that night, it built me this. And it analyzes the sentiment of an email with the AI builder components for language and sends the results to Teams. Now, that could be Slack, that could be any number of workflow things. So you can imagine this, like if you want to be notified every time you get an angry message from your boss, or anytime there's a high priority support ticket or something like that. You could customize this just a little bit to do all that and do anything you need after that. Text my phone, send me an email, whatever. So let's take a brief look at what this is, and then I'll show you what it sends. So when you go in here, and if you're familiar with Logic Apps at all, this design surface is going to look pretty similar. So a lot of the Power Automate stuff, these flows trigger off an event. So when a new email comes in, now I have this limited to a specific personal address of mine to trigger. So don't send me a bunch of emails trying to get it to fire nasty Teams messages at me all day. So it strips all the HTML stuff out, leaves us just the text. It then goes through some things to like break out lines and do some stuff we don't really care about. It selects the language. So this, had I sent myself an email in German or French or any of the like 90 plus languages that it supports, this would work for that too. So if you're an international company or something like that, this would work great. So it's initializing a lot of stuff. There's where it's actually detecting the language. So it asks the service for the right thing. It analyzes a positive, negative, or neutral sentiment in text, sets that, and then posts what it calls a card in a chatter channel. And like I said, this can be any messaging app at all. So when we come over here, and so this usually takes a couple minutes. So again, I've kind of TV food showed this. And I want to call your attention to something easy. So I get a nice Teams message, important email, negative sentiment. So I get some session feedback from myself, which is something I should talk to my therapist about. And I was not a great fan of this session. Okay, this was my favorite session of the day. Positive, that makes sense. This session wasn't the best for me. Speaker should have stayed home. Negative, makes sense. This one to me is interesting. So sentiment analysis is really cool. Like I said, very handy tool to analyze the language of anything. And then if you need to react off that, you're going to go in knowing, ooh, I have an angry customer, angry boss, whatever. But that says I'm not a big fan of the session and tells me to stay home next time. Does that sound neutral to any of us? It's not. So while this stuff is very smart and it's sometimes pretty attuned to sarcasm and things like that, there are little gaps in it. So always, anytime you're doing something like this, especially if you're going to drive like an automated workflow off what's deemed to be a negative message or something like that, make sure the content of the message comes along with it, because the sentiment analysis may have misread something there. So I just want to call your attention to that. Any questions about that before we get into Azure SQL for the last two?
Could you theoretically design something like in Power Automate to answer your messages based on how you've answered similar messages in the past?
So the AI builder components there, I'm not aware of any that would specifically do that, because it's a little bit, you don't kind of get free reign to tell them what to do. Like you do, but you don't. And I know that doesn't make sense, but
That makes sense.
you can tell it to do something, and you can give it a lot of guidance on how to do that. And as you saw, there's a Copilot within there. So you can tweak the flow after you've made it or after Copilot's made it. And you can ask it those sorts of things, but it's not always going to have the context to do that right. It does kind of operate in its own box. That would be something where, and we could go down this rabbit hole, but something like a virtual agent, you could absolutely do that, because you could give it grounding data originally and then supplement that with a variety of other kinds of data, and then you could get that. But that would be more of a virtual agent than what I just showed. Okay, so like I said, we're going to end this back in Azure SQL. We kind of took a trip over to Power Automate world, but we're back in data now. So did anybody know that you can call APIs from Azure SQL? Well, you can. So let me walk you through real quickly here. We got, I don't know, about 8-9 minutes left. So this is normal T-SQL stuff. We're not seeing anything wild here, right? So for performance purposes, we're setting, a single row here, and we're saying, give me the description of the product that matches this ID and this culture. So it sets that, and then we're pointing it to my OpenAI endpoint. There is a little grown-up code here. My API key, which I'm going to cycle after the session, so don't take that and use up all my monies, but you won't be able to in about 5 minutes. And then what we're doing is, so these are going to be familiar to you if you've seen any AI sessions, any like chat interface things at all. We're telling it what it is. You're an AI assistant that helps people find information, and then we're giving it an additional prompt to tell it your role. So in this case, you're an experienced marketing expert. Generate 2,000 letters of ad copy for the product we just did. And then there's some T-SQL down here, and it calls it. So what comes out? So I'll go ahead and run this live. The response time's anywhere from 2 seconds to sometimes 30. Generally falls in like 10 to 15. One time it made a fool out of me and took like 57, and I didn't have any jokes to fill the space, so that wasn't great. It's taking longer than normal now. Fair to say, I think when I ran this before, just to make sure everything was good to go, it returned in like 7. But naturally, when we're in front of a bunch of people, it doesn't do that. Like I said, once we hit 30 seconds, I'm out of things to say. So it really needs to speed up. I do have one pre-baked. Guys, this has never actually failed. I'll be honest with you there. Aha, so I thought it was going to make a liar out of me, but it didn't. So generally that's a lot better. So I'm going to copy that. So we're talking about like really cool stuff, AI, cutting edge tech. So of course I'm going to use Notepad to show that to you, because it's an easy way to just drop text in, right? So I'm not going to make you read all this, but this is indeed 2,000 words about a bike. So this is ad copy talking about how great it does on corners, great ride, low price point, blah, 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 blah. Cool stuff. And so T-SQL did that. So you're like, okay, Matt, I don't care about marketing copy for bikes. But for any of the data people, if you've ever been asked to write a data dictionary, how useful would it have been to call an API and say, look at my database, look at these tables, look at these columns, look at these views, and describe them? You've got a heck of a starting point there. So there's, you're calling ChatGPT from T-SQL. Now, please don't run out and say, Matt said to run it against all our production databases all the time, every row. No, but there's a lot of power here to describe the database itself and to describe the data in it if you're asked to do that. And it can help kind of enrich our understanding of it too. If there are databases that you inherit from a new job or somebody leaves or whatever, I think there's a lot of power here to do just that. I also want to call out one other thing. So I saved this, and we'll look at what's highlighted here. So I changed the prompt for this, and I told it to be an exhausted, sarcastic marketing expert, and give me like 250 words on this bike. So it made jokes. It made fun of somebody's ex. That prompt now doesn't work, and that's why I saved this. So this, you'll see, I don't think that joke's racy at all. That's why I leave it in a session. I don't think it's offensive to anybody. I certainly hope not. It now runs afoul of the content moderation guidelines. So where you could give it a substantial amount of personality and get it to say it's much funnier stuff than this that probably was a little racy, it won't even do this now. So just kind of an interesting thing to call out the evolution of this stuff and how they moderate the content that it generates and all that. So if we're talking about data dictionaries and stuff, probably we're not going to have to worry about adult content or violent content or anything like that. But it won't really generate even stuff that I think is kind of funny anymore. Any questions about that before we get to the last demo here? All right, well, you may notice that's the same image. And that's because we're going to flip this around. So we essentially just got our database to go ChatGPT on us. So what if we can plug something like ChatGPT into our database? So yes, I want to leave that site. So what I've done here, just to give you kind of a quick tour, is I'm in the Azure OpenAI Studio. So again, these studio experiences, you're going to hear them talk about all the time when they talk about AI experiments and welcoming you into it and all that. You go to this. You have to have a service provision, so that would be in Azure. They're not they're not cheap, but you can pause them and turn them off and all that stuff. And I'm in the chat playground of the studio. So you're like, okay, Matt, I know what ChatGPT is. I don't know why this is interesting at all. Well, it's about to be, I hope. So I'm going to add some data to it. So I've gone here. I go to add a data source. So our options are here. We're going to use Azure AI Search, which, fitting to the start of the talk, used to be called Azure Cognitive Search. So I'm going to go ahead and create that. And I know I have a resource in there. So which service, and you're going to see I have a few provisioned over the years from different demos and stuff. I know this one, and it's going to spin over here, and it's like, okay, what indexes do you have in that search object? So you may wonder what that is. So this part I can't, I could show, but it's very boring and would make a terrible demo. So what I did is there's a different experience you do to do this, but I created an Azure AI search index off the Walmart products Kaggle table that we talked about in the demo earlier. So it indexes all the information that I tell it to. At the time that I created this, with integers, it wasn't great. So it was very adept with language and product descriptions and things like that. But trying to map the price fields, struggle with that. It's better now. Um, but so you'll see, like, if I were to go ask in the next thing, how, what's our most expensive greeting card, like, it's not going to know because it didn't have the ability to index those fields the way it needed to. But that's changed. So I select the index I made. That's all the Walmart products Kaggle table. And from here, it's going to be a fair amount of next. So keyword search is all I've got because I don't have the ability to supplement this data right now. That we'll talk about this on the last slide. There are ways to change that, but for the purposes of kind of our introductory demo and time, we're not going to do that. So we're going to go through here. System assigned managed identity doesn't work anymore the way that it was. So I'm going to go through and it's going to supply the API key for itself. So I don't have to, so you see, I didn't write a line of code, but I've plugged my database table into basically the chat playground of OpenAI Studio, and we're going to have a chat with it, a brief one. So we'll say, what greeting cards do we sell? And then the interface is a little clumsy. It will then scroll back to like the top of the messaging thing. So I've given it no prompt. It is basically just out of the box assistant. I've given it no personality. I've given it no role, no direction or anything. Because I want you to see there's no smoke and mirrors here at all. This was empty. So we added it, and then it gives me, now obviously the language is not that exciting, but it gives me back, okay, here's some greeting cards we sell. And then it says, these are just a few examples. It provides me references. So very chat GPT-ish. That's off data that I own. That's off an Azure SQL database that I have. So if you're sitting out there as a data person saying, well, this AI stuff, okay, you showed it. It's an ADS, I get it. I'm not a Power BI person. I don't really care about that. You can put chat GPT experiences over data in a database, and you're not putting your database under load because it's searching the index that you created off the data. What you can do from here, like if I go into this, I can give it text to speech, speech to text, just simple. I can just turn it on here. I just have to have a resource to do that. I can deploy it as a web app. I can deploy it to Copilot Studio and do some things there. So you can kind of see how the ecosystem ties together, and you can supply that experience to your users in lots of different ways. But hopefully you think that's cool. It's really cool. I enjoy being able to show that because, that's for me, that's one of those skills that I don't know that every data person has. I know I only added that demo probably 3 months ago, and every time I've done it in person, I get a lot of nodding heads like, oh, that's really cool. I didn't know you could do that at all. And people starting to think of ways to use that, either to help users or impress their boss, which is okay too. I encourage it. So what comes next? So we talked about doing what I just did, which again, super simple, straightforward, and deploying a Copilot from there, and then you can do a lot of cool stuff there. You may have seen on social that Azure SQL database, so vector search is something that's been in private preview for a while. There were announcements that went out from that team, I think yesterday, that there's now a native vector type. So where you not arguably, used to have to get a specific vector database to store that kind of information. Azure SQL has the ability in preview to do that now. So that enables us to do like RAG processing and things like that, calling OpenAI from Azure SQL, kind of tying together everything we talked about that last 15, 20 minutes or so. The session I do at FabCon Europe, the final demo will be that. So that's basically where I'm not just taking an index I created off a table in a snapshot in time, but I'm augmenting that conversation, that chat I just showed, with updating data in real time and using Azure SQL to do it all. So I think that's really cool. Once I've been able to present that at FabCon here in a couple weeks, I'm really looking forward to getting that demo out into SQL Saturdays and user groups and stuff like that, because I think that's kind of mind-blowing stuff, especially for DBAs saying, well, where do I fit in all this? Like, we can do cool stuff with that. And you know what comes next? Something we have no idea about, because that keeps happening all the time. When I built the structure of this session a year ago, half this stuff didn't exist. So, and I'm sure in 3 months, 6 months, whatever, it's going to be the same. So how will this impact us? We talked about ways that can help us do our jobs: conversation bots, automated answers to things, creating data dictionaries, doing chat GPT stuff, from our data to our data, all that stuff. The main takeaway is this: we're already surrounded by it. Most of the stuff I showed today are tools that a lot of folks use. It's not specialized stuff. It's not AI focused stuff even. It's just stuff that's around. Like I said, this session changes every time. So it changed a lot. If you saw all this and you're like, Matt, all that was lame, I don't get it, watch this space. Something I just showed you, if you think it's lame now, it won't be. And it's going to be something that can help you do your job, help it be a little easier, help it be a little more fun, and let you focus on the parts of your job that you really enjoy. It is overhyped for sure. But engage with it. Don't let it scare you off. Don't say like, this stuff isn't for me. I think there's something for every data person in that last hour. There's something for all of us in there, and I think it's pretty fun to play with too. So you want to impress my wife, there's the link to buy the books. These slides will be on my GitHub tonight. Thanks for coming. Thanks for hanging out for, I guess, probably an hour and 5 minutes. Sorry. Like I said, I'm SQL at speed everywhere online. The line in my GitHub is there. The resources slide I mentioned over and over with in-depth stuff on a lot of this is right here tucked in at the end of the deck. And that's all. Are there any questions?
Any in the chat. So I know you're on a tight schedule to get down to present this in Ohio. So I'm guessing this content's not going to change between now and then. But
I hope not.
you might get a brilliant idea on the way, right?
I might, yeah.
But thank you so much for presenting this virtually for us today. We really, really appreciate it. Welcome to our group, and we look forward to having you again. Thank you so much, Matt. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Bye all.
Okay.